Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. On Christmas Eve, I stood outside the house I had helped pay for my arms stiff from the cold, my breath turning to ice as the door shut in my face. After 3 years of giving my son and his wife over $200,000, I was left in the snow like a stranger. By dawn, while I sat in silence, their cards were declined one by one, their mortgage auto-pay bounced, their accounts frozen. I am Mary, and this is the night I lost a son but found my dignity. For clarity, here is what I covered each month on average. Mortgage $2, $200, tuition $800, braces $300, SUV payment $400, Lisa's credit card $600, utilities and miscellaneous $300, $700. That's roughly $600, $5,000 per month. Across 36 months, the total easily exceeded more than $200,000. I drove with both hands steady on the wheel, my eyes tracing the glint of streetlights that bent across the icy asphalt. Denver in late December has a way of making every road feel longer, every shadow sharper. The snow that had fallen all afternoon lay heavy on the roofs, softening their edges while driveways gleamed with patches of ice that the plows had missed. The farther I went from Tom's neighborhood, the quieter it grew, as if even the air understood that families were already gathered inside, keeping their warmth and noise to themselves. The gifts in the back seat shifted whenever I turned the sound of paper against paper like a whisper that would not let me rest. I told myself I should not take it personally, that boundaries were a word people like to use now that Lisa might even believe she was protecting her children. But in the deep of my chest, I felt something much colder than the weather. I thought about Anna waiting to share her writing about Ben, who once called me his lucky charm before every game. I wondered if they had asked where I was, or if they had already learned not to ask. At a red light, I let the car idle and closed my eyes. Behind the lids came a rush of years. The night James and I first brought Tom home from the hospital, the way his tiny hand wrapped around my finger with the stubbornness he would carry into adulthood. The Christmas mornings when James stayed up all night assembling toys, laughing at instructions that never made sense. The smell of coffee and pine when the house was full of cousins and music, and we never thought it could change. The light turned green. I pressed the gas gently and told myself to stop looking backward. Still, the past clung to me like the snowflakes that refused to melt on my windshield. I remembered the first time Tom asked for help after James passed. He had called with his voice tight, saying the mortgage was a little more than expected and the promotion had not come through yet. I said, of course, what mother would not help. Then came Anna's tuition, Ben's braces, Lisa's credit card bill that she said was just a mix-up with travel expenses. Each time I told myself it was temporary, that I was keeping the family afloat until Tom found his footing. 3 years later, I had given away more than I ever imagined, and still they stood on sand. The heater hummed. I held my fingers over the vent until they tingled with life. I looked at the time on the dashboard and realized it was only a little past 7. The night stretched ahead endless, though. In other houses, the same hours would pass too quickly, filled with laughter and wrapping paper and children who could not sleep. I wondered if Tom had looked toward the door after Lisa closed it. I wondered if he had thought about his father, about how James would have handled such a moment. When I turned onto my street, the snow was deeper, not yet disturbed by tire tracks. My small house waited with its single lamp burning in the front window, a habit I kept from the days when James traveled for work. I pulled into the drive and shut off the engine. For a long while, I stayed in the car listening to the tick of cooling metal and the faint hiss of the wind. The gifts sat in the back seat like witnesses accusing me of foolish hope. Finally, I carried them inside one by one, setting them gently on the kitchen table. The pie went into the fridge. I peeled off my gloves and pressed my hands to the counter until the ache of cold eased. The silence of the house wrapped around me heavy and absolute. I walked to the living room and turned on the tree. The lights blinked awake, casting soft colors over the ornaments James and I had collected for decades. Each one told a story, but tonight the stories felt far away like voices through glass. I sat down in my chair and stared at the tree. My phone lay on the armrest. I picked it up and scrolled through Tom's number again, hovering over call. I thought of Lisa's face at the door, the curve of her smile that never reached her eyes, the words she had chosen so carefully. Money will not keep us frozen. She thought she was making a point, thought she was teaching me that love cannot be purchased. The bitter truth was that I already knew. I set the phone down. My reflection wavered in the window behind the tree, a woman older than she imagined herself sitting alone on Christmas Eve with gifts that had nowhere to go. I thought of James again, of how he would say family was everything, that you always take care of your own. I whispered his words into the quiet room and felt the weight of them press down. For the first time in years, anger stirred beneath the sadness. Not a wild anger, but a steady flame that warmed places the heater could not. I realized that Lisa's cruel smile and Tom's silence had shown me something I had refused to see. I was not part of their celebration. I was a transaction, a checkbook, a solution they had come to expect. Standing in the snow tonight had not been an accident or a misstep. It was a message. I leaned back in the chair and let the truth settle. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the street, smoothing every sharp edge. Tomorrow would come with its phone calls and its explanations, but tonight there was only the steady drift of white and the hum of lights on a tree that had seen better days. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence, a silence that for once felt honest. I drove home with the snow flickering in my headlights, my body stiff from more than the cold. Inside my small house in Littleton, the silence felt louder than usual, as if the walls knew I had been turned away. I set the gifts back on the kitchen table, still wrapped in paper that now looked gaudy and out of place, and sat in the chair where James used to read the paper. My hands rested flat against the table, and I thought about the years since he died in 2021, how everything had unraveled thread by thread, until I was sitting here alone, counting the cost of my hope. It began with the mortgage. Tom had called a few weeks after the funeral, his voice tight, telling me the payments were heavier than expected, that his promotion at the tech company had been delayed. I had been raw with grief and eager to keep him close, so I wrote a check without hesitation. It felt like the right thing, a way to carry James's spirit of responsibility forward. I told myself it was temporary, that Tom just needed a bridge. The bridge turned into a road. Anna's tuition came next. St. Mary's Private required $1,200 a month, and Tom admitted they could not cover it. Lisa spoke on the phone that time, her voice sweet but edged with pressure, reminding me that Anna was gifted and needed the best environment to thrive. I said yes, of course. What grandmother would not want that for her granddaughter? Then came Ben's orthodontist. $300 each month for braces that would save him pain later. Tom said they had already stretched their budget too thin. I had the money and they knew it. I said yes again. The list grew longer. A car lease for Lisa, $600 each month. A maxed credit card that needed to be paid off, $700. Family trips they swore were for the children's enrichment, with hotel bills that made me wince but sign anyway. Vacations to California, a week in Florida. Lisa posting pictures online that made it look as if they had earned every bit of it. I wanted to believe they deserved it, that I was helping them live the kind of life James and I once dreamed for them. Month by month, I became their safety net, $5,000 disappearing regularly from my account. Over 3 years, it added up to more than $200,000, enough to buy a smaller house outright, enough to rebuild my own retirement security, enough to make me feel I had thrown pieces of myself into a pit I could never fill. I told myself it was love. I told myself I was buying closeness, that each check would be a thread pulling us together. But the visits came only when bills were due. The phone calls slowed unless they had something to request. I began to notice the way Lisa's eyes flicked to Tom whenever I arrived, as if calculating what she might ask for next. I noticed Tom's silence when conversations drifted to money, the way he let her speak for him, his hands folded like a schoolboy being scolded. I remembered one afternoon when Anna ran to me with her journal, proud of a story she had written about a girl who fought off monsters with nothing but her courage. Lisa stepped in quickly, telling Anna not to bother me with childish things, and then leaned close to mention that the tuition was due again. Could I please cover it early this month? The joy in Anna's face dimmed as she was ushered upstairs. I left that evening with the check written and an ache in my chest that no amount of generosity could soothe. The worst part was how natural it became. I kept track of their bills like they were my own. I knew the due dates, the amounts, the penalties. I felt anxious when I thought of missing one, as if their household depended entirely on my vigilance. It dawned on me slowly that they had built their lives around the expectation of my help, not the occasional kindness of it. James would not have wanted this. He was a man of steady planning, of saving for emergencies, of living within means. We had managed well, never rich, but comfortable, proud to send Tom to college without debt, proud to own our modest home outright. When I thought of how he would shake his head at Lisa's taste for handbags, and Tom's willingness to indulge her shame wrapped itself around me. There were small moments that cut deeper than the big checks. Lisa once joked at dinner that I was like their personal bank, always open, no questions asked. She laughed, but Tom did not correct her. Another time, I overheard her on the phone bragging to a friend that she never had to worry because her mother-in-law was footing half their bills. She said it with a careless tone, as if it were a mark of cleverness, not dependency. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing how far I had let myself fall into this role. I was not a mother or grandmother in their eyes. I was a purse with legs. I wanted to believe Tom still cared, that somewhere under Lisa's influence, he remembered the values we had taught him. But each month that passed, each check written, pulled me further from that hope. Sitting in my living room now, the tree casting soft light across the carpet, I traced the numbers in my head like a ledger. $200,000 in 3 years. My freedom traded piece by piece for the illusion of belonging. I wondered what James would say if he could see me now. I wondered what Anna would write if she knew the truth, if she understood that every page of her education had been bought with her grandmother's silence. I pressed my palms against my knees and tried to steady my breathing. The quiet of the house felt heavy, but inside that weight, a spark of anger flickered. I had thought I was buying love, but all I had bought was obligation. And tonight, standing in the snow while Lisa smiled and closed the door, I finally saw it for what it was. I leaned back and let the anger burn long enough to warm me. Outside, the snow kept falling, muffling the world, giving me space to think. Tomorrow would come, and with it choices I had avoided for too long. For the first time in years, I was ready to make them. I sat in the quiet of my living room with the tree still glowing in the corner, and my mind kept replaying the dinners I had endured at Tom and Lisa's house. They came back in fragments, not one long memory, but scattered moments that told a story I had refused to hear. At first I thought they were nothing, just little slights I could brush away, but together they became a wall between me and the children. There was the Sunday dinner when Anna bounced into her seat beside me with her notebook clutched to her chest. She wanted to read a story about a girl who fought monsters with clever tricks. Before she could open her mouth, Lisa leaned over smiling at the table and said, "Grandma might be too tired tonight." She suggested Anna save it for another day. Tom just kept passing the potatoes, eyes fixed on his plate. I told Anna I wanted to hear it later, but the light in her face had already dimmed. Then there was the summer evening when Ben, his baseball gloves still on his hand, asked if I could come to the park to practice with him. His excitement was so pure it made me forget the heavy air. Lisa stepped in quickly, saying it was too hot for me, that the heat might be dangerous. Tom added that traffic would be terrible. Ben nodded like he had expected that answer all along and went back to poking at his food. Each time Lisa's words painted me weaker, smaller, more fragile. She never said it sharply. She dressed it as concern, as kindness, but it carried the same weight. I became the grandmother too delicate to read stories, too frail to sit in the sun, too fragile to be a full presence in their lives. Tom never corrected her. He let the narrative stand, and the children learned to look at her before they looked at me. There were other moments, quick and cutting. At Thanksgiving, she prepared a special plate for me, food chopped into tiny pieces set in front of me as if I were already incapable of holding a knife. At birthdays, she reminded the children not to tire me out with games, as if laughter might send me to the hospital. Even when I tried to join conversations, she redirected them smoothly. If I asked about Anna's writing, Lisa told her to save her voice. If I asked about Ben's practices, she told him to let me rest. I wanted to tell myself she meant well, that she was nervous about keeping things under control, that she thought she was protecting me. But the longer it went on, the more I understood it was not protection. It was erasure. Each polite correction pushed me further to the edge until the children no longer asked me things directly. Once I invited Anna to a bookstore, hoping to keep our little tradition alive. Lisa texted back that Anna had too much homework, only for me to see a photo later that day of the two of them at the mall on a shopping trip. The caption read, "Girls' Day." My stomach turned when I saw the smile on Anna's face. I wanted her happy, but I also wanted her to remember that she had asked me first. Tom was no better. He stayed quiet, letting Lisa speak for both of them. When I tried to talk with him alone, telling him I felt like Lisa was keeping me at a distance from the children, he told me not to take it personally. He said Lisa was focused on calm and structure. Then, as if to soften the conversation, he asked if I could help cover a delayed mortgage payment. I agreed because I did not want conflict, but I walked away feeling hollow. The children tried in small ways to reach for me. Anna once slipped her notebook into my purse and asked me to write her a line she could build a story on. I scribbled one about a girl who finds courage in the snow. Ben whispered that he wanted to show me a new routine for baseball practice, and that he would do it when nobody else was watching. These secret exchanges warmed me, but they also underscored how much they had been taught to hide our connection. The last dinner before Christmas made everything clear. I brought a box of old ornaments from Tom's childhood, hoping the kids would enjoy hanging them on the tree. Lisa thanked me, then put them back in the box, saying the tree had a color scheme and mismatched ornaments would ruin the look. Anna reached out anyway, but Lisa stopped her with a glance. Tom asked me about the drive, mentioning that winter roads are hard on older reflexes. The words were ordinary on the surface, but together they told me exactly where I stood. Driving home that night, I realized Lisa had built a story about me piece by piece, and Tom had agreed by silence. In her story, I was no longer a grandmother with energy and opinions. I was a fragile burden to be managed. She was the one who cared for calm, for order, for boundaries. I was the disruption, the complication. The worst part was how much I had cooperated. I had played along, telling myself it was easier than arguing that the children would grow and understand one day. But in that quiet drive, I understood I had allowed myself to disappear from their daily lives. Love had become a performance, one I could not afford to keep staging. I stood at my own window later watching the snow cover the street, and I thought about James. He would never have let anyone erase me with such ease. He would have spoken up even if it meant conflict. I whispered his name into the silence and promised myself I would not let this continue. The tree lights blinked behind me, steady and small, and I finally understood that what Lisa had taken from me was not just dignity, it was presence. She had pushed me outside of their world one correction at a time, and Tom had let her. I turned away from the window with a calm I had not felt before. The decision was not fully formed yet, but its outline was clear. I would not be erased. I noticed the first cracks in Tom's supposed success during one of those family dinners when conversations drifted toward his job. He worked at a SaaS company in downtown Denver, a place with glass walls and endless coffee, and he liked to describe himself as a rising star. Lisa beamed every time he spoke, nodding as if rehearsed, but the numbers never added up. He called himself a paper millionaire because of his stock options, but the truth whispered through their bills and their requests. The shares were locked, the RSUs had not vested, and the company stock had slid almost 30% since summer. On paper, he looked wealthy. In his bank account, he was barely afloat. I began to catch details in their voices when they forgot I was nearby. One evening, while Lisa cleared plates, I heard her telling Tom that they had to wait for the next tranche to vest before considering any big moves. She whispered quickly, maybe thinking I would not hear, but my ears picked up the tightness in her words. She wanted to remodel the kitchen again, said a family of their status could not live with laminate counters. Tom reminded her that his paycheck was already stretched, that the mortgage, car payments, and tuition were consuming every cent. Lisa brushed it off, saying it did not matter because Mary always made sure they were covered. Her words left me frozen in my chair. She said it so casually, like my name was another line item on their budget. Later that same week, I walked past the patio where Lisa spoke into her phone with a friend. Her laugh carried clearly through the glass door. She said we never worry about money because we have our own personal bank named Mary. I gripped the edge of the curtain and felt my stomach twist. I wanted to burst outside and demand she repeat it to my face, but I stayed still, letting the humiliation sink in. The more I listened, the more I understood. Lisa spent as if the world would always refill her accounts. Designer purses hung from hooks in the hallway, shoes arrived in boxes stacked by the door, vacations were planned with first-class flights and resort hotels. When bills came due, she simply looked to Tom, who then looked to me. I had become invisible as a person, visible only as a purse that opened on command. Tom himself seemed trapped. He still carried the calm face James once had, but his eyes darted when money came up. One afternoon, he stopped by my house under the pretense of dropping off Anna's school project. He lingered in the doorway, shuffling his feet before saying his company had delayed a bonus. He asked if I could spot them just this month, that it was temporary. I wrote the check because I wanted to believe him. After he left, I stood at my kitchen counter staring at the ink line on the signature line, realizing I had funded yet another hollow promise. Lisa never pretended to be ashamed. At Thanksgiving, she bragged about the perks of Tom's stock options, about the condo they might buy in Aspen once everything vested. She spoke as if the wealth already belonged to her, as if the struggles of cash flow were beneath her concern. When a cousin asked how they managed private school and luxury vacations at once, she smirked and said, "We have good support." Her eyes flicked toward me, quick and sharp, like a knife disguised as a glance. I thought of James that night, how he had taught Tom to mow lawns as a teenager, how he insisted our son understand the value of every dollar. James had grown up poor, saving coins for school books, and he had promised me we would raise Tom with different values. Seeing Tom now caught between his wife's hunger for status and his own fear of losing her approval, I felt James's absence like a wound. What hurt most was how normalized it had become. Lisa's friends knew. They knew I was the steady current under their lifestyle. Once at a barbecue, I overheard her chatting with a neighbor, saying it was nice having an extra safety net since Mary helps out with things. The neighbor laughed, maybe thinking it was generosity. I knew it was dependence. Even the children were not untouched. Anna once asked if I could buy her a new tablet for school because Mom said you like to help with things like that. She said it without hesitation, without shame, like it was an expectation. I smiled at her and promised to think about it, but inside I wanted to cry. Ben, too young to understand, once thanked me for their trip to Disney, saying Mom told us you made it possible. I realized then that Lisa was shaping their perception of me, not as a grandmother who told stories and baked pies, but as the financier of their fun. The image settled deep. I was not their family. I was their bank. A living ATM with a name and a tired smile. Every dollar I had given was meant to buy closeness, but what it purchased instead was distance, because the more I paid, the less they saw me. I sat at my own table that evening with my checkbook closed in front of me. The Christmas lights blinked outside, soft against the snow, but they did not warm me. I remembered Lisa's laugh on the patio, the way she said our own personal bank named Mary. The words echoed louder than the quiet house. My hands rested flat on the wood. I knew something had to change. For the first time, I let myself imagine a life without the steady drip of checks. I pictured their faces when the money stopped flowing, the shock when automatic payments failed. I imagined the silence after their calls went unanswered. A shiver ran through me, not from the cold, but from the clarity that had finally arrived. I leaned back, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and realized the next step was already forming in my mind. I would not confront them yet, not until I was ready. But I knew the day was coming, and when it did, the story Lisa had built about me would crack wide open. The house glowed like a postcard when I pulled up that Christmas Eve. Snow had been falling for hours, blanketing the sidewalks and frosting the rooftops, but their front windows shone with steady warmth. I balanced the pie in one arm and shifted the bags of gifts in the other, each ribbon tied carefully, each label written in my own hand. I reminded myself that this was family, that whatever undercurrent I had felt these past years could not erase blood. When the door opened, Lisa greeted me first. She wore a red sweater that matched the garland, and her hair caught the light like spun gold. She leaned against the frame and asked if I had managed the drive all right, her voice wrapped in politeness that held no weight. Tom appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a towel, and said it was good to see me. He gave me a quick hug that felt practiced, then turned back toward the kitchen. The children rushed to the hallway, and my heart lifted. Anna's eyes went straight to the packages, and Ben called out that he smelled apple pie. For a second, everything felt the way it should. Then Lisa placed her hands on their shoulders and reminded them to calm down. She said, "Grandma always brings too much that excitement over presents should not be the center of the night." Her words slid out smooth, but the look she gave me was sharp. At the table, the food was arranged like a magazine spread. I placed the pie beside the roast and offered to carve it as James had always done. Tom shook his head quickly, saying he had it under control. I asked Anna about her writing, and she started to tell me about a story, but Lisa cut in and said Grandma should eat first, before tiring herself with long conversations. Anna's voice trailed away, and she fixed her eyes on her plate. When Ben brought up baseball, I told him I had found a net so he could practice in the garage. His face brightened, but Lisa answered before he could. She said practices would wait until spring, that the cold was not good for me. She gave him a smile that dared him to argue. He looked down at his green beans and nodded. The meal went on like that, every small thread of connection snipped neatly. Lisa filled the spaces with talk about routines and order. Tom asked about the weather and traffic. I chewed food I barely tasted and reminded myself to breathe slowly. After dessert, the children were sent upstairs to clean their rooms. I gathered the dishes and carried them to the sink, grateful to have something to do. Steam rose from the hot water, and for a moment I felt useful again. Lisa appeared at my side with a towel, took the dish from my hands, and set it aside. She thanked me, then said softly that this was a good time to talk. Tom leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed, his eyes avoiding mine. Lisa began with a smile that looked rehearsed. She said they had been reflecting on patterns and wanted to make changes. She said the children were starting to expect expensive gifts and that it was creating an unhealthy environment. She said they wanted to teach love without materialism, and that my habit of showing up with so much was overwhelming. Her tone was gentle, but every word landed heavy. I tried to answer, saying I only wanted to make the evening special, but she shook her head. She said intent did not erase impact. She added that I seemed more tired lately and that long visits might not be good for my health. She suggested it would be better if I headed home early, that the children needed stability and calm. I looked at Tom. I waited for him to speak, to defend me, to say that family mattered more than polished routines. He lowered his eyes and said nothing. The silence spoke louder than any words. I asked if I could at least say goodnight to Anna and Ben. Lisa shook her head kindly, saying bedtime transitions were delicate. She promised they would explain it in the morning. Tom rubbed the back of his neck and mumbled that the roads would freeze if I stayed longer. I buttoned my coat with shaking hands. The gifts still sat by the wall unopened, waiting like forgotten promises. I picked them up and held the pie tin under my arm. Lisa walked me to the door and repeated that they appreciated everything I had done, but that they needed boundaries to protect the children. She said we would all feel better once expectations were reset. From the doorway, I looked back into the living room. The tree sparkled with glass ornaments, each one perfectly placed. The stockings hung in exact order on the mantel. It was a picture of family, yet I stood outside of it. I told Tom I loved him. He whispered that he knew his eyes fixed on the rug. Cold air hit me as soon as the door opened. Snowflakes stung my cheeks, and the porch light made the falling flakes look like silver needles. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing their warmth inside. I stood there a moment listening to muffled laughter upstairs. The sound pierced me in a way I cannot describe. I made my way down the steps, slowly, careful on the ice. My car waited under a dusting of snow. I set the gifts on the seat beside me and slid behind the wheel. The engine struggled before it caught filling the cabin with a low hum. I sat there not ready to drive, staring at the square of light that was their house. In the rearview mirror, the window glowed like a beacon of belonging. I thought of James carving the roast of Anna, reading her first story of Ben swinging a bat with both hands. All of it seemed far away now, as unreachable as stars. I pressed my hands against the steering wheel until they stopped trembling. I told myself I would remember this night not to torture myself, but because clarity sometimes comes only in the sharpest cold. Then I put the car in gear and pulled away the crunch of tires on snow, carrying me back toward Littleton, toward a house that was small, but still mine. I drove home through streets buried in white, the heater slow to chase away the chill that clung to my skin. The pie dish sat empty beside me, and the unopened gifts shifted with each turn. By the time I reached my driveway, the neighborhood was silent, each house glowing with the promise of family gathered inside. Mine was dark. I stepped in, set the bags down on the counter, and stood still. The cold I carried in from their porch seemed to seep into every room. I could not sit, could not sleep. I pulled out the folder where I kept receipts and bank statements, a habit James had started years ago. I spread them across the table under the yellow kitchen light. Lines of numbers marched like soldiers, each one a record of the years I had tried to buy belonging. Tuition payments for Anna's private school, orthodontist bills for Ben, the car note on the SUV, mortgage contributions every month without fail. Altogether more than $200,000 since James died. I stared at the total and felt something inside me harden. The words Lisa had thrown at me hours earlier replayed in my head. Money would not fix what was broken. She was right, but not in the way she thought. I realized my money had not fixed anything. It had only chained me to a role I could no longer bear. I remembered her smug laugh with her friend about having a personal bank named Mary, and then her parting smirk when she said gifts did not equal love. She had frozen me out, left me in the snow. I would return the lesson. I put on my coat again, tucked the statements into a folder, and drove before dawn to the branch bank in downtown Littleton. The lot was empty except for a single car dusted with snow. I knew Patricia Coleman would be there. She was the branch manager, a woman with silver hair and steady hands, who had helped me with James's accounts when he passed. She lived for her work and often came in early to prepare before staff arrived. Through the glass doors, I saw her bent over her desk. She looked up in surprise when I knocked. Her eyes widened, but she waved me in. The lobby smelled faintly of pine cleaner, the Christmas wreath still hanging crooked on the wall. Patricia asked gently if something was wrong. I sat across from her and slid the folder forward. I told her I needed to cancel all automatic transfers connected to my account immediately. She raised her brows and reminded me that some had been in place for years, that removing them would cause disruption. I nodded and said that was exactly the point. She scanned the list, her expression tightening as she reached the bottom. Mortgage payments, tuition, car loans, credit cards, utilities, all flowing from me to Tom and Lisa. She asked if I was certain. I said I had never been more certain of anything. She paused, then began typing, her fingers brisk. The sound of her keys was like the swing of an axe. When she finished, she looked up and told me the changes were effective immediately. I thanked her. My voice shook, but not from regret. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me solid and clear. Patricia hesitated, then said she hoped my family would understand. I smiled without humor and told her they would understand soon enough. By the time I returned home, dawn was breaking. Pale light seeped across the snowdrifts, and the air bit sharper than before. I made coffee and sat by the window, cradling the cup as if to steady myself. Across town, Tom and Lisa would be stirring. They would check their phones, expecting smooth transactions, and find only rejections. I pictured Lisa at the kitchen counter, her manicured nails tapping the screen as she tried to pay the credit card bill. I could see the frown forming the words "insufficient funds" flashing back at her. Tom would try to make the mortgage payment before the holiday grace period ended, and the same message would appear. Anna's school tuition draft would fail. The auto pay for Ben's orthodontist would bounce. Each screen would deliver the same cold message, the digital echo of the front door closing on me. The irony was cruel and perfect. Just hours before, Lisa had sneered that money would not buy love. She had told me I was freezing the children with gifts, and now her own accounts, the lifeblood of her lifestyle, were frozen solid. Karma did not wait months or years. It arrived overnight, swift and precise. I thought of Tom's silence at the table, his eyes lowered when I needed him most. I thought of the children upstairs, shielded from the cruelty of what had just happened. They would not understand yet, but someday they would. For now, I let myself imagine Lisa's voice rising sharp as she demanded answers. Tom scrambling to call the bank, both of them realizing the safety net had vanished. Outside my window, the snow glittered in the early light. The street was empty, the world hushed as if waiting for what came next. I closed the folder of statements and slid it into a drawer. My hands were steady now. They had cast me out into the cold. By morning, the cold had found them too. Patricia's office was warm compared to the icy lobby, but I still could not stop shivering. She had pulled up my account on her screen, her eyes narrowing as lines of transactions filled the page. She scrolled slowly, murmuring to herself, and then looked at me with something close to disbelief. She told me that in 3 years, I had transferred more than $200,000 to Tom and Lisa. My breath caught in my throat, even though I had suspected the number. Seeing it displayed so plainly made the truth sharper, like a blade pressed to the skin. She asked if I truly wanted to end it all at once. I said yes. My voice cracked, but my resolve did not. She reminded me that these payments covered important things: their mortgage, Anna's tuition, Ben's orthodontist utilities, even Lisa's personal credit cards. I told her that was the problem. Every corner of their lives had been built on the assumption that I would always pay. Patricia hesitated, her fingers poised over the keyboard, and then she asked me to sign a form confirming the cancellations. My hand trembled as I held the pen. It was not fear, but a flood of memories. Tom holding my hand at James's funeral, promising we would remain close. Anna crawling into my lap with her first storybook. Ben asking if I could watch him swing at the park. Lisa's tight smile when she reminded the children not to tire me. All of it swirled together as I signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. The signature looked strange, like it belonged to someone braver than me. Patricia printed the confirmation pages and slid them across the desk. She said it was done. Every auto pay, every standing order, every monthly draft was canceled. The words landed in my chest like a bell tolling. Final. Irreversible. For a moment I felt dizzy as if the ground had tilted. Then a wave of lightness spread through me, fragile but undeniable. She looked at me with concern and asked if I was all right. I told her I was, that I felt both broken and mended at once. She said families can heal in time. I smiled faintly and told her I was not sure healing was possible, but that dignity was. She pressed her lips together, then reached out and squeezed my hand, a quiet gesture that steadied me. I left the bank with the folder pressed tight against my chest. Outside, the sky was pale gray, and the snow reflected the weak sun in blinding shards. My boots sank into the drift as I crossed to the car. I slid into the seat and sat for a long moment without starting the engine. The folder lay beside me, heavy with more than paper. It was proof that I had finally chosen myself. On the drive home, I replayed Patricia's words. $200,000. My stomach twisted at the enormity of it. How many times had I told myself it was temporary, just one more month, just until they got back on their feet? I had believed those excuses because I wanted so desperately to belong. And each check I wrote was another thread binding me tighter to their demands. I had not noticed that the rope had become a noose. The houses I passed looked festive, with lights strung across porches and wreaths on doors. Yet, instead of feeling like an outsider, I felt oddly free. For once, I was not driving toward another obligation. I was driving home to my own life, however quiet it might be. At a stoplight, I opened the folder again and traced my finger down the list of canceled payments. $2,200 each month for the mortgage, $800 for Anna's school, $300 for Ben's braces, $600 for Lisa's card, $400 for their SUV. The total each month had been more than many families lived on entirely. I whispered to myself that it was over. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun had climbed higher, melting a thin crust of ice from the roof. I carried the folder inside and set it on the kitchen table. The tree still blinked in the corner, cheerful and oblivious. I stared at the unopened gifts piled by the counter, the ribbons already fraying where I had clenched them too tightly the night before. They were symbols now, not of generosity, but of expectation. I made coffee and wrapped my hands around the mug, watching the steam rise. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in years, the silence felt like my own, not like punishment. I thought about Lisa's words that money could not fix what was broken. She had meant it as accusation. She had been right, though not in the way she thought. It was not money that broke us. It was dependence, greed, and silence. I imagined Tom and Lisa that very morning. Lisa standing at the counter tapping her phone, her smile fading as one payment after another bounced. Tom frowning, trying again, only to see the words insufficient funds appear. Their security gone overnight, their comfort pulled out from under them. It was not revenge that I tasted, but justice, and with it a sorrow that felt clean instead of suffocating. I carried my coffee to the window and looked out at the street, the snow glittering beneath the sun. Children dragged sleds across the hill at the end of the block, their laughter high and bright. I remembered Ben asking me to watch him play baseball Anna, whispering about a story she wanted to finish. My chest ached, but it was not regret. It was hope that someday they might see me as more than money, that the lessons of this winter might plant seeds they would understand when they were older. By the time the clock struck 10, I felt steady enough to put the folder away. I slid it into a drawer and shut it firmly. The decision was sealed. My hand still trembled, but my heart was calm. For the first time since James died, I felt as if I had taken a step toward him rather than away. He had believed in self-respect. That morning at 10 a.m., at last, I had honored him. The morning after the bank meeting, I woke with a heaviness in my chest and a strange clarity in my mind. For the first time in years, there was no automatic draft waiting to leave my account, no quiet bleeding of funds I had convinced myself was love. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee cooling in my hands and knew what I had to do next. The money I had saved with James's careful planning was still mine to direct, and if I wanted to protect what mattered, I needed to make my intentions unshakable. That meant seeing Robert Mallory. Robert had been more than a lawyer to our family. He had been James's trusted advisor, the man who helped us close on our first house in Boulder back in the 80s, the one who sat across from us at a diner when we set up retirement accounts, the one who shook my hand with tears in his eyes at James's funeral. He was older now, in his 70s, with hair as white as the snow piled against the sidewalks, but he still carried the same quiet authority. When I called his office, his secretary put me through immediately. She said Robert would make time that morning at 10 a.m., and by 10 a.m., I was driving downtown through streets glazed with ice. His office was in an old brick building with brass numbers on the door. Inside, the air smelled of cedar polish and old leather. Robert rose when I entered, tall and a little stooped, his glasses sliding down his nose. He took my hand warmly and studied my face. He said I looked tired. I told him tired was better than empty. We sat in his office where shelves sagged with law books and family photographs. A photograph of James and me from a barbecue years ago still stood in the corner, a reminder of better times. I opened the folder Patricia had given me at the bank and pushed it across his desk. I told him I needed to change my will. His pen stilled in his hand. He asked if my health had changed. I shook my head. My health was steady, but my patience was not. I explained in measured words how more than $200,000 had left my accounts in 3 years, how every bill of Tom and Lisa's had been paid by me, how I had been frozen out of their home on Christmas Eve. His mouth tightened, but he did not interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back and asked carefully what I wanted. I said I wanted Tom and Lisa removed entirely as beneficiaries. Their names should no longer appear on any document tied to my estate. Instead, I wanted a trust established for Anna and Ben. Robert asked what conditions I had in mind. I told him they must be objective, enforceable, and fair. A minimum GPA while in school. A requirement for volunteer service in their community so they would learn the value of giving without expecting a return. Completion of a financial literacy course before they accessed college funds. And above all, the trust must pay directly to institutions for tuition, medical bills, or essentials, never to Tom or Lisa. If either child were convicted of a serious crime or asked for funds outside of those rules, the trust would close and the remainder would go to charity. Robert raised his brows and said it was strict. I nodded. Strict was the point. He reminded me that excluding Tom would be permanent, that it might cut the last thread between me and my son. My throat closed, but I forced the words out. That thread was already frayed beyond repair. I wanted my grandchildren to see that love was not bought, that money could support growth, but never replace dignity. He took a deep breath and began drafting. The sound of his pen against the paper was steady, deliberate, like the rhythm of a gavel. I watched snow drift against the window while he wrote. I thought of James, of how proud he would be to see me finally take a stand. I thought of Anna and Ben, of their small hands wrapped around mine. I wanted them to grow up free of the entitlement that had poisoned their parents. When Robert slid the draft across the desk, my eyes scanned the lines carefully. The words were stark but powerful. Tom and Lisa's names were gone. In their place were clear stipulations for Anna and Ben's futures. No wiggle room, no loopholes. Only responsibility and opportunity. My hands no longer trembled as I signed. The ink flowed smoothly, the letters bold, as if claiming their rightful place. Robert watched me sign, then folded the papers neatly into a file. He asked one last time if I was sure. I said I was. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded with a kind of solemn respect. He told me James would have been proud. The words pierced me, but in a way that healed rather than hurt. When I left the office, the sun had climbed higher, casting the snow in sharp light. I walked slowly to my car, the file under my arm like a shield. Each breath I took felt clearer. I knew Tom and Lisa would rage when they discovered what I had done, but their anger no longer frightened me. I had drawn a line that could not be erased. Driving home, I passed the park where Ben once swung a bat while Tom shouted encouragement. I remembered Anna scribbling stories in her notebook during family dinners. I whispered to myself that they would understand one day that the trust would protect them not only with money, but with lessons their parents had failed to teach. Back in my quiet kitchen, I set the file beside the canceled auto-pay confirmations from the bank. Side by side, they were proof of my decision. No more siphoning of my life into their lifestyle. No more silent suffering. I had chosen dignity. I had chosen boundaries. And I had chosen to honor my love for my grandchildren in a way that could not be twisted. I sat at the table until the light faded, listening to the hush of my house, feeling for the first time in years that it was truly my own. The first knock came before the sun had risen, sharp and insistent, rattling the frame of my front door. I froze in the hallway, clutching my robe tighter, already knowing who it was. Tom's voice carried through the wood, hoarse with fury, demanding that I open. He shouted that the mortgage company had called, that his credit card had been declined at the gas station, that Anna's school was threatening suspension unless tuition was paid. His words echoed down the quiet street until lights flicked on in a neighbor's window. I did not answer. I stood still, my breath shallow, my heart pounding, but I would not move the lock. I had made my choice. Outside, Lisa's voice rose above his, sharper and crueler. She accused me of destroying the family, of humiliating them in front of the children. I pressed my hand against the door and felt the vibrations of their fists pounding. For a moment, I wondered if the wood would splinter. From across the street, Mrs. Peterson's front door creaked open. She stepped onto her porch in her slippers, arms crossed, watching. She called out if everything was all right. Tom turned his face red and barked back that this was private, that his mother had lost her mind. The words stung even though I had expected them. Mrs. Peterson shook her head, and I knew by evening the story would be winding its way through every house on the block. I stayed silent until the pounding finally stopped. Through the peephole, I watched them retreat to the car, Lisa still shouting, Tom gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched. My knees gave way and I sank to the floor, trembling. I told myself not to give in. The noise outside was only the sound of chains breaking. The next day the siege began again, only louder. Lisa slammed her fists on the door until the wreath fell crooked. Tom paced the porch, his phone pressed to his ear, likely trying the bank again, hoping someone would tell him it was a mistake. When no one came to the door, they sat in their car, engine running, staring at my windows. The neighbors watched. Curtain shifted. Shame curled in my stomach, but I clung to the memory of signing the trust papers with Robert. That moment had meant freedom, and freedom was never free of cost. On the third day, the pounding stopped, replaced by something worse, a small knock, hesitant and soft. I opened the curtain a sliver and saw Anna, her hair in braids, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked so small against the snow piled on the porch. My heart cracked open. I opened the door just enough to let her slip inside. She looked around, her eyes catching on the unopened gifts still stacked near the tree. She asked if I hated them now. The words pierced me. I knelt and told her no, that I loved her and Ben more than anything. I explained gently that my decision had nothing to do with hate. I said love was not measured in money, that giving too much had confused everyone, that I wanted her to know my love was free. Her lip trembled. She whispered that Mom said I had abandoned them. I shook my head and held her hand. I told her I had only stopped paying for things I never should have been paying for, that I wanted to spend time with her for her stories, not for her parents' bills. She looked down at her shoes, then back at me with wide, searching eyes. She asked if she could still read to me sometimes. My throat tightened, but I told her yes, always. We sat at the table for a few minutes. I poured her hot cocoa, and she wrapped her small hands around the mug. She told me about a story she was writing for school, about a girl who built a boat to escape an island. Her voice trembled, but she smiled as she spoke. I listened, tears burning my eyes, and told her she was already braver than she knew. Outside, Lisa's voice sliced through the air, calling her name. Anna jumped hurriedly, finished her cocoa, and hugged me tight. She whispered that she missed me and rushed to the door. Through the window, I saw Lisa grab her arm and bend close, demanding what we had talked about. Anna shook her head, and Lisa's face hardened. They walked to the car where Tom sat slumped, staring at his phone. In the days that followed, they came again and again, sometimes shouting, sometimes pleading, sometimes sending notes slid under my door. Tom once stood in the snow for an hour, calling out that I was destroying my grandchildren's future, that I was punishing innocent children. Lisa accused me of being selfish, of choosing pride over family. Their words pounded harder than fists, but I forced myself to stay quiet. One evening, I heard Ben's voice outside, high and uncertain, calling, "Grandma, are you there?" My body ached to throw the door open to gather him into my arms, but Lisa's command followed quickly, and his voice fell silent. I pressed my palm against the cold wall and whispered that I loved him, though he could not hear. The neighborhood grew restless. Mrs. Peterson spoke to me once when I collected the mail. She said she admired my strength, that people had seen enough to know where the fault lay. I thanked her, though my cheeks burned with humiliation. Inside my house, I wrote in my journal each night, recording every visit, every word, every knock. It was not only protection, but a way of reminding myself that I was not imagining the siege. Each page was a record of my decision holding firm. The days blurred, but one thing remained constant. No matter how loud they shouted or how pitifully they begged, I did not open the door again, except for Anna that once. The more they raged outside, the steadier I grew inside. For years, I had bent to every demand, written checks to silence every storm. Now the storm raged louder than ever, and still my pen stayed in its drawer. By mid-January, the news about Tom's company was everywhere in Littleton. A neighbor who worked in finance mentioned it to me at the library, speaking in a hushed tone, as if repeating gossip too heavy for daylight. The SaaS firm that had once made Tom feel invincible had announced a sweeping reduction of bonuses and a delay investing stock options. Shares that had been the core of Tom's self-image were sinking week by week. It was no secret anymore that their household was bleeding, and people in town whispered about how quickly the shine had worn off. I watched from my window one morning as Tom trudged to his car, the once polished sedan coated in salt stains. His head hung low, his phone clutched in his hand as though he could will better news from the screen. Lisa emerged behind him, still dressed to impress, her coat tailored, her lipstick sharp. But I saw her jaw tight, her movements clipped. She glanced toward my house, and I knew that resentment was boiling beneath the thin veneer she fought to maintain. A few days later, she came to my door again, not shouting this time, but smiling too wide. She carried a stack of papers in a neat folder and said she wanted to discuss my future. Against my better judgment, I let her step inside, but only as far as the entryway. She pulled out documents and began explaining that guardianship was common, that it would protect me legally, that banks and doctors would appreciate having Tom authorized to make decisions. I scanned the pages and my stomach turned. If I signed, she would have the power to access everything. Her tone was syrupy, but I saw the panic beneath it. She insisted that with my age and declining energy, it was practical. I cut her off. I told her firmly that my mind was clear, my decisions were my own. I would never sign it. She pressed again, her eyes hardening, voice rising. I told her to leave or I would call the police. The mask shattered. She snatched the papers back, crumpling them in her fist, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. That evening, the shouting from across the street spilled into the neighborhood. I heard Tom's voice raw, accusing Lisa of humiliating him, of pushing too far. Lisa screamed back that he was useless, that he had failed to provide, that without me they were nothing. I sat in my armchair with the fire burning low, listening to the echoes of their marriage unravel. The neighbors must have heard too, because the next morning, Mrs. Peterson gave me a knowing look, her lips pressed tight. In the days that followed, Tom tried again. He came to me alone, his pride gone, his eyes sunken. He begged for a bridge loan, just enough to cover the mortgage until his next review. He said he was drowning, that the company was unstable, that he feared losing everything. I told him gently that I could not help. His face crumpled, his hands balled into fists, but he said nothing. He turned and walked down the steps, his shoulders slumped like a man twice his age. Lisa's attempts grew more venomous. She cornered me at the grocery store, blocking my cart with hers. She hissed that I had ruined their lives, that Anna was being teased at school, that Ben was asking questions she could not answer. I told her calmly that children learned resilience from truth, not from endless money. Her face flushed red, and she spat that I was selfish, that I cared more about control than family. I pushed past her, my legs trembling, but my resolve intact. The facade of their wealth cracked further. The shiny SUV disappeared from their driveway, repossessed overnight. Lisa's social media, once a parade of vacations and handbags, went silent. Friends who once dined with them stopped calling. They no longer attended gatherings at the country club. Their windows were drawn, their yard unkempt. Each glimpse revealed how deeply they were sinking. One evening, Anna slipped away and came to me again. She sat at my kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a cup of cocoa, and whispered about the constant fighting at home. She asked why money made people mean. I stroked her hair and told her not all people were like that. That kindness mattered more than wealth, that she must remember the difference. She leaned against me, trembling, and whispered that she wished she could live with me. The words pierced me, but I also felt a strange strength. My choices were planting seeds she could not yet understand. As winter deepened, Tom began leaving before dawn and returning long after dark. Word reached me that he had picked up extra shifts at a warehouse to cover bills. His once pristine suits hung loose on him. Lisa, meanwhile, lingered in the house, still clinging to appearances but visibly fraying. She no longer waved at neighbors. Her smile was brittle. Her steps hurried. I sat by my window most nights, the glow of their house dimmer than before. Their voices carried still, but the fury was softer now, worn down by exhaustion and fear. It struck me that what I was hearing was not only the collapse of finances, but the collapse of pride, of the illusion that they had built on my sacrifices. I did not rejoice. I felt sorrow for the children, for the version of Tom I once knew, for the family dinners that might have been. Yet beneath the sorrow was something new, strength, freedom. Each desperate knock that went unanswered, each cruel word that slid off me instead of into me, each failed attempt to bind me legally was proof that I had finally stepped out of their shadow. By February, the snow began to melt, leaving muddy patches on lawns. From my porch, I watched Tom clear his driveway with slow, heavy motions, his breath clouding in the air. Lisa stayed inside, curtains drawn. Their empire of glass was collapsing, and all I had to do was let it fall. I woke one morning to the sound of birds I had not heard in months. Spring was beginning to return to Littleton, and with it came a sense of possibility I had almost forgotten. For years, my days had been shaped by wires, transfers, and obligations, but now I felt free to shape them myself. I made coffee in James's old pot, the one with the dented handle, and sat at the kitchen table without the usual dread of a phone call demanding money. For the first time in a long time, my time was truly mine. I decided to put it to use. At the library, I asked about joining the Tuesday book club. The librarian, a cheerful woman with silver glasses, wrote my name on the list. That first meeting felt like stepping into a room where nobody needed anything from me except my voice. Helen Brooks was there, an old friend I had not seen much of since James's funeral. She greeted me with such warmth I nearly cried. The group discussed a novel about a woman who leaves behind a life that no longer fits. When it was my turn, I said the hardest part of leaving is believing you deserve to. Heads nodded. Helen squeezed my hand. Encouraged, I signed up for volunteer hours at the library. On Thursdays, I shelved books sliding spines into order, and on Saturdays, I helped with children's story time. The first time a toddler in a bright red sweater waved at me after listening to a picture book, my chest tightened with a mix of joy and ache. He reminded me of Ben when he was little, running across the yard with fists full of dandelions. I stayed anyway because the ache was better than the emptiness I used to feel after writing another check. Helen also brought me to the food bank on Mondays. The warehouse smelled of onions and cardboard, but I found a rhythm there, bagging apples and handing out rice. A grandmother with tired eyes thanked me for a sack of potatoes, saying it meant her grandson would have enough to eat. I thought of Anna and Ben and realized giving time felt different from giving money. It filled me rather than hollowed me out. At home, I rediscovered small joys. I planted basil and parsley in the kitchen window. I cooked recipes I had clipped years ago, but never tried lemon chicken, chickpea stew, maple bread. The house filled with smells of herbs and baking instead of the sharp metallic odor of stress. I even pulled out my old sketch pad and drew the tulips that sprouted in the front yard. The lines were shaky, but they were mine. News of Tom and Lisa reached me through whispers. Mrs. Peterson mentioned seeing a rental truck outside their house. Soon after, a for sale sign leaned crooked in the lawn. I watched from my porch as movers carried out boxes, Lisa barking orders, Tom pale and silent. They were moving to an apartment closer to his night job. I felt the pull of old reflexes, the urge to rush over with a check to make it easier. But I stayed where I was. The weight was no longer mine to carry. I still wrote everything in my journal. Each entry was proof of my decision, a reminder that silence was not abandonment, but recovery. I wrote about the laughter in book club when someone misread a line about the pride in a child who spelled his name correctly at story time, about the gratitude in a man who carried groceries out with his head high. These were my new measures of value. The letter from Anna arrived in late March. The envelope was addressed in her careful handwriting, loops large and uneven. My hand shook as I opened it. She wrote that she had started saving her allowance in a jar, that she liked watching the coins climb. She said her class was doing a project about spring birds, and that she was learning to plan without asking for more. She told me she missed my stories, especially the one about the girl who built her own boat. Tears blurred the words. She had not asked for money. She had told me about her efforts, her growth, her memories. She was learning resilience, the very lesson I had prayed would take root. I folded the letter and placed it in a tin where I keep my treasures. James's movie ticket stub, my mother's recipe card, a pine cone Ben once pressed into my palm. Anna's letter belonged there. At the next book club meeting, I shared a piece of the letter. Helen smiled and said, "Recovery often looks ordinary, but feels extraordinary." Later, over coffee at the cafe, she told me she was proud of me. I laughed, really laughed for the first time in years, without covering it with guilt. I added more volunteer work helping seniors at the library with computers. I showed them how to set up email, how to search for recipes, how to print pictures of grandchildren. Each thank you landed softly in my chest. One woman told me learning something new made her feel less alone. I thought of Anna's letter and nodded. News of Tom and Lisa continued in bits. Their SUV was gone, repossessed. They had moved again to a smaller place with thin walls. Tom worked nights at a warehouse in addition to his day job. Lisa tried a part-time job at a boutique, but quit. Neighbors said they looked tired, older. I listened, but did not intervene. I wished them well from afar, but I no longer felt responsible. On a Sunday in April, I brought maple bread to the food bank. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying over the fence. I paused at the baseball field where a Little League team practiced. For a moment, I could almost hear Ben asking me to watch him swing. I let the memory come, then let it go, trusting that someday I might watch again without the shadow of money between us. Back home, I opened the curtains wide. Sunlight spilled across the table and lit up Anna's letter. I set a notebook beside it and wrote back, not to send yet, but to keep. I wrote that I was proud of her, saving that strength grows when you choose wisely, that stories last longer when shared. I tucked it into the tin and felt at peace. That evening, I cooked a simple meal, set one place at the table, and ate slowly. The silence no longer hurt. It wrapped around me like a quilt. Outside, snow melted into the soil, and inside I felt a seed of hope taking root. I sat in the garden as April ripened into May, the air soft and scented with lilacs. The grass had grown lush after the last snow melted, and the trees stood proud in fresh green. I unfolded Anna's letter again, tracing her careful handwriting as if the strokes themselves could steady me. Each word was proof that my love had not been erased, that it lived quietly inside my grandchildren, waiting for its season to bloom. I read until the ink blurred with tears, then let the sun dry the page as I held it in my lap. The garden had always been James's pride. He used to kneel in the dirt humming while planting rows of tulips that burst red every spring. Now I cared for them. I clipped the dead leaves' tied stems gently and whispered to myself that resilience is a kind of beauty too. Sitting there, I understood that though I had lost a son to pride and greed, I had gained something deeper. I had reclaimed my dignity. The chains of obligation no longer dragged at my ankles. I thought of Tom and Lisa often, but not with the same weight. News trickled in through the neighborhood. They were struggling to stay afloat in their apartment. Tom worked long hours, and Lisa withdrew from the social circle she once ruled. People said their fights could be heard through thin walls, their finances stretched beyond repair. Once such stories would have pierced me, driving me back into the cycle of rescue. Now I listened, I breathed, and I let it pass. Their downfall was not my punishment nor my joy. It was simply the natural consequence of choices made and truths ignored. Anna's letter reminded me that children learn even when adults try to shield them. She wrote about saving coins, about standing on her own. That told me seeds of responsibility were sprouting despite her parents' mistakes. Ben was younger, quieter, but I trusted he too would find strength as he grew. Someday, when they were old enough, they would see me not as an ATM or a scapegoat, but as a grandmother who loved them enough to step away. As the weeks passed, I settled into a life I had built for myself. I went to the book club each Tuesday and spoke more confidently. At the food bank, I became known for steady hands and a calm voice. At the library, seniors greeted me as the woman who could help them open emails or print pictures of family. These small roles stitched together a fabric of belonging that I had craved all along. I had not lost a family entirely. I had found a new kind of one woven from kindness freely given and received. Still, evenings often pulled me back to memory. I would sit with tea on the porch, looking at the street where Tom's house once stood proud. Now, another family lived there. Children riding bicycles across the driveway, laughter spilling into the twilight. I wondered if Tom ever glanced toward my house from his apartment, if regret gnawed at him or if pride still blinded him. I would never know unless he chose humility, and I could not carry that for him. What I carried instead was peace, a soft blanket of knowing I had done all I could, and that letting go was not cruelty, but survival. The letter stayed on the table by my window. Sometimes I reread it aloud, letting Anna's young voice echo in my mind. She remembered my stories she wrote about saving. She said she missed me. That was enough. Enough to keep hope alive that one day, older and wiser, she and Ben would come find me, not for money, but for love. And when that day came, I would be ready whole and strong, no longer desperate to buy affection, but willing to give it freely. One afternoon, Helen joined me in the garden. We sat with glasses of lemonade, listening to bees fuss among the blossoms. She looked at me and asked if I regretted any of it. I thought carefully before answering. I said I regretted the years I spent chasing a bond that could not be bought. I regretted giving away pieces of myself to keep peace that was only an illusion. But I did not regret finally stopping. I did not regret standing up for myself, even if it cost me a son. Helen nodded, her eyes soft, and said that sometimes losing what you think is family is how you find who you really are. The truth is, betrayal cut deep, but dignity heals slow and steady. My journey had been painful but necessary. I realized that true love cannot be purchased, coerced, or measured in dollars. It can only be lived. The spring breeze carried that lesson through the lilacs and into my bones. As I folded the letter one last time and placed it back in the tin with my other treasures, I whispered to myself that I was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had chosen. I had chosen self-respect. I had chosen peace. And I had chosen to believe in a future where love could grow without price tags. If you have ever faced betrayal inside your own family, if you have carried the weight of being used or dismissed, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Perhaps together we can remind each other that true love, the kind that endures, never needs to be bought.